On and off. So we keep it off.
Testing on the mic? Yes, we still see people coming in, so we will get started in a minute or so. Thanks. Now that Harun is in the room, I guess we can get started. Very welcome, everybody, to this panel on social protection in the era of polycrisis. We have been talking about social protection the whole day. I hope you have enjoyed the panel discussions that we have had over the afternoon. Great to see that everybody's back now in the panel, in the plenary discussion for the grand finale for the day. I would also like to welcome viewers who are joining us online. Thank you very much for taking the time to join this discussion with us. This discussion happens at a time where a lot of things have happened. I mean, just a couple of years ago, we were in the midst of a global pandemic. And that was the time when social protection came into the awareness of not just those working on the social protection programs and policymakers, but for the broader audience who realized the importance of social protection in times of crisis, but also the inadequacy of the current systems that we had. It was quite obvious the importance that they made for people who were faced by these new shocks, and also those people who didn't have the privilege of being covered. Since then, we have been hit by several shocks. We have been hit by new climate crisis, different conflicts, geopolitical turbulence of different sort, and we're now in the era of more overlapping crisis that we have come to refer as the era of polycrisis. Or as the people who are living in poverty would say, business as usual. Quite a lot of people who are living in poverty face different types of crises on daily basis. And we know that social protection is an effective vehicle in our fight against poverty. It's an important way of countering different types of shocks and providing agency to people to deal with different unexpected events in their lives. Yet we are still struggling to extend the coverage of social protection to where it's needed, the delivery and financing of these services to all who deserve it. So today's panel consists of leading experts in this field who have generously provided their time and promised to share their knowledge on what are the recent innovations and what we have learned from all of this crisis during the past years. My name is Elina Scheja. I'm Chief Economist at the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA. I also have the privilege to chair the OECD DAC's Community of Practice on Poverty and Inequalities. And in both of these roles, the importance of not losing track on our common commitments on poverty reduction and the importance of social protection to get us there is of utmost importance. So it is my privilege to moderate this panel today. How this will work is that I will give each of our speakers time to make their opening statements, lay the ground and make their bearing arguments for our discussion. And we will then have a moderated discussion for a couple of rounds building on the contributions from each of these speakers. I will then open up the floor to questions and answers and your contributions. So start thinking already now about what questions you might want to ask our panelists. To my left, we have Danielle Gilligan, who is the Director of Poverty, Gender and Inclusion Unit at the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, who's going to contribute with his extensive knowledge from rigorous impact evaluations on what works, what could be scaled up, and what have we learned. Next, we also have Amber Peterman, who is the Impact Evaluation Specialist at UNICEF, based in Nairobi. She has previous wide research experience also from the University of North Carolina, from UNICEF Innocetti, also from IFPRI. So IFPRI is well represented here today, contributing from inclusion angle and also from your experiences from the African continent, where you're based at the moment. Our third speaker is Santiago Ledi, who is a senior fellow with the Global Economy and Development Program at Brookings. Doesn't really need much more of introduction. I would just like to mention as a glimpse that he has been the president of the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association, has experience from the Inter-American Development Bank, and also served as the deputy minister at the Ministry of Finance and Public Credit of Mexico. Last but not least, I'm really happy that we're joined by Finland's own Tomi Järvinen, who is the executive director of Finn Church Aid. He's been working for that organization for the past decade, but also comes with further experience from, also particularly from the African continent, working for World Vision and FIDA International. So we do have a lot of experience in this panel today. I won't take more of your time, but over to Dan to kick us off. Over to you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alina. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm very excited for this discussion. So I'm going to kick us off with a little bit of motivation for this session. We know that evidence supports that we're in a period of compounding crisis. So in terms of health shocks, climate risks, in terms of intensifying conflict, economic instability, it's not hard to see and feel that around us. But also the IPCC concludes that with high confidence that global warming increases the risk of harmful weather events such as droughts, floods, and tropical cyclones. Conflicts continue to create loss of life and economic instability. One political risk assessment I've seen recently concludes that conflict zones have increased 2/3 globally in their coverage just since 2021. And on infectious disease outbreaks, not just COVID-19, but we have many, many other examples, many much more localized, but from H1N1, Ebola, et cetera, et cetera. The economic literature has demonstrated that these types of shocks largely go uncovered. We are not insured, households are not insured against their exposure to these shocks. So these adverse shocks cause households to have to reduce consumption, sell assets, take other measures that end up worsening their food security. In some cases, they lose employment, and generally increase vulnerability to chronic poverty. So this definitely suggests a motivation for social protection and an expanding role in crisis response, in addition to the kind of role of standing safety nets around promoting development and poverty reduction. I want to use my few minutes here to talk about a few examples of social protection models and what their role can be in this space. And I want to start with adaptive social protection. And adaptive social protection is really sort of the right fit, I would say, at this time as a model. It's been around for some time, and I know that there's different jargon for this, but this is largely combining standing safety nets with preparation on the part of government and their partners to flex in response to shocks, to either expand vertically in terms of giving households who are already recipients of safety nets additional transfers, or horizontally, where households are newly brought into the program. In kind of the best iteration of this, households are sort of pre-registered for the opportunity to sort of get access to transfers or social protection as shocks occur. With social protection reaching 2 billion people globally, they are in part a platform that makes it possible for governments to respond. That's part of why this sort of adaptive model works so well, that in countries that have robust, rich standing safety nets, they already have a lot of the infrastructure needed to kind of expand in these times of shock. And so it also allows them to contract when shocks have completed, and so are hopefully a more efficient model than just kind of large, broad transfers. There's been a lot of discussion already today about targeting and whether we should be targeting or thinking about basic income. I will not give you the final answer on that today, but I think here the benefit in terms of fiscally for adaptive social protection is in part on that ability to scale and then shrink. We know also in terms of besides sort of vertical and horizontal expansions, there's sort of piggybacking that can happen where other complementary interventions can take place. Each of these were tried during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We saw a really massive run-up in investment by governments in social protection schemes, many of which were temporary to try to adapt to the employment shock of COVID, and then were scaled down again. Another example of effective adaptive model is in Ethiopia in 2015. There was a very serious drought, and one that would have kind of really upset things and created a food security crisis in Ethiopia in past times. It did not do so in 2015, in part because the government had the pieces in place. They had the Productive Safety Net program, their standing public works program, but they scaled it as well in response to the drought to effectively mitigate and reduce the risk of a really serious food security crisis. So on the piggybacking idea, social protection can also be a platform to integrate with climate-related policies. So some of the cash plus approaches that are out there are used to promote crop diversification, soil and water management, and then other models are also just integrated on climate outcomes. So work by my IFPRI colleague Hervonen showed that the public work program in Ethiopia rehabilitated land, increasing tree cover by 4%. So these models are there, and that's part of what I kind of want to share, is that both sort of the adaptive models and existing models can already be quite effective. We have kind of mounting evidence for that. So next, I want to turn to graduation model programs. So the graduation model has become, based on some very strong evidence that they are highly effective, it has become something that governments are really taking up. So by that I mean economic inclusion programs are sometimes called ultra-poor graduation. These typically are sort of a big push model. They involve delivery of financial services, lump sum asset transfer, routine consumption support, and training. And increasing evidence that they can be very effective at reducing poverty, improving household welfare. So at IFPRI, we've been studying a version of this type of model called SPEAR in Ethiopia. I just want to share some results from our findings there. We were conducting an RCT of the program to measure its benefits, but also wanted to see how effective it was at helping mitigate the effects of drought. So we mapped the data, the household survey data from our RCT onto satellite data on precipitation and temperature in a period from 2018 to 2021 when it was really only a period of moderate drought. What we found is that households in the control group that were not part of the SPEAR program had worsening situations in terms of food insecurity, livestock holdings, women's diets, women's BMI, and intimate partner violence. All of those got measurably worse as a result of relatively moderate droughts, and households that were in the SPEAR program did remarkably better. The adverse effects on those other households were much less, substantially less, so that the kind of net effect, the impact of getting SPEAR during drought was actually quite substantial. We were surprised at the scale of these effects. So this is an example where a standing safety net is already doing quite a lot of work for us in terms of helping to address relatively moderate droughts. In that case, scaling up was not really needed. Okay, I will come to just one more example, which is one of anticipatory action models. Sam Jones gave a really nice talk this morning about Mozambique's attempts to kind of scale up an anticipatory action model. So this is where households are kind of registered in advance, and there's forecasting of upcoming weather shocks, usually. And then there's a trigger on that forecast that would actually trigger transfers to go out to households in anticipation of the shock, so several days before the shock rather than afterwards. And so this is a compelling model. Theoretically, it's strong. So my colleague Alan DeBrow and Jeff Bloom at IFPRI have a nice sort of theoretical treatment of this, kind of explaining why this should make a lot of sense. My concern about anticipatory action models is kind of their scalability. We had some work done in Nigeria showing that they can be effective. And it was quite encouraging, actually. They were quite a bit more effective in terms of than giving transfers kind of just after the shock. They improved outcomes in terms of income and livestock holdings in this case study in Nigeria. So it's really encouraging, and I think more work should be done on it. My concern is about kind of the level of complexity needed and whether with that complexity this could be scaled. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much, and I will pass to Amber. Oh, maybe not.
Nora, I do keep my mic, and thank you very much for talking about the importance of building the institutions and systems before we need them, and building on the different shocks being assisted by different, the same system being able to respond to different types of crises. How do we get everybody on board then, Amber?
Hey, thanks. Hi, everyone. So I'm a researcher, but I sit in Nairobi currently now at UNICEF with fantastic social protection leads, so I'm going to try and channel them a little bit in this discussion. I also wear a few different hats, so I'm part of the SPIAC-B working group on gender, also part of the Transfer Project working on gender and inclusion. Shout out to the Transfer Project colleagues in the room. So flying a few different hats, but also always thinking about gender and inclusion threads through the various work. So what my colleagues are telling me from the region is that we're seeing a strong pushback starting to form against social protection in favor of rural livelihoods and jobs agenda. So this is part of the cost effectiveness framing, getting the most bang for your buck in terms of your investment. And so this is not just from international organizations, but also trickling through to governments as they are revamping and rebuilding and renewing their different social protection models. Okay, so this, in my mind, bypasses a very important prioritization on human rights and equality, right? So in this environment, I think it's really important to remind ourselves that social protection is a right, not a privilege. And this is clearly stated in many founding documents, including the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So social protection should be grounded in dignity, equality, and citizenship, not charity, contingency, or productivity, right? So I think it's good, and it's one of the purposes of this conference to present the evidence on effectiveness. And so we can say, okay, we know social protection, and especially social assistance, where the evidence is much stronger. We know that this increases girls' education. We know it increases women's economic livelihoods, increases mental health for women, decreases intimate partner violence, and this is great, and we should be documenting these effects, right? But this should not detract from our rights-based arguments. So social protection is actually supposed to address these inequalities and these risks that come from discrimination across the life course, whether it be gender, age, nationality, ethnicity, etc. And so I think this is a really important tone, I think, to set in the current environment. And this is coming from my social protection colleagues who are having these discussions now with governments. So I wanted to end by making just a few points that align with what the SPIAC-B Gender Working Group is setting forward right now on shared principles for gender-responsive and inclusive social protection to make sure this inclusion lens isn't left behind in the next few years. So I'll make 4 of them. The first is to set clear objectives for gender equality and progressively tailor social protection for gender transformative impact. So what this means basically is that we know different national systems are at different levels when we think about incorporating gender inclusion, but meet them where they are and try to actually set these goals incrementally as we go forward. So the goal should be working towards systems which challenge unequal power dynamics, resource distribution, and harmful social norms. The second, which I want to pick up on, is to design, reform, and adapt existing social protection systems to respond to care and support across the life course. So from a gender's perspective, we're seeing a lot of invigoration and sort of new focus on care, finally. So social protection policies can directly and indirectly support progress towards the 6R framework. And I know every time you hear about the R framework, there's another one added. So let me just read them out. The framework dictates that social protection can work towards decent care, towards recognition, reward, redistribution, reduction of unpaid care work, as well as representation and resources towards care workers. And so if it's not obvious to everyone in the audience, this can be through support to caregivers, through integration of care credits to pension systems, the public provision of childcare, including in public works programs, and related investments in care infrastructure. So the third is to ensure inclusion, participation, and representation across the social protection system. And I think this was touched on the opening panel as well, that one of the ways to get social protection to be more inclusive, including gender inclusive, is to actually involve these groups as part of the system. So make sure your social protection system officers have gender balance in terms of employment, make sure women's rights organizations are included in consultations to hold governments accountable, et cetera. And then the last point I want to make in terms of the principles is to do more work and do more research, taking, of course, a gender and inclusion lens. And this includes collecting basic data that can be disaggregated by gender, age, disability, and of course, in all your fabulous impact evaluations that you're working on now and will be presented at the next UNU-WIDER conference. So I'll just leave it there for now, but I really want to stress that, we are coming to this time where there will be big shifts, and we cannot leave this equality lens behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Strong case for the inclusion of that lens, and also another example of combining different policy areas and making more with the same resources that we have. Santiago, please.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much to Kunal and to Patricia for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. So I'll speak a little bit about social protection and labor markets. My viewpoint is inevitably biased by my experience in Latin America, but I think what I have to say is useful for countries in MENA, and looking forward, probably useful for countries in other regions of the world. This morning, Luis Felipe, in the first panel, said, grow, invest, insure. And I'm in agreement, but I would say, wait, grow, invest, and insure in the right way. Because if you don't insure in the right way, you're not going to grow as much as you want it to grow. So that it is not any kind of social insurance that we're talking about. That's the key point that I want to make this afternoon. It is just not any insurance, but it has to be insurance well thought out, that is effective, and that at the same time facilitates growth. And I want to go back to what you might want to think, the original problem that we have with social insurance. And you think the original problem is that, I don't know, 60 years ago, whatever, 80 years ago, we didn't think carefully the mapping between what risks should be insured by whom and who should pay for what. And de facto, what it evolved is a system of social insurance, by and large, based on wage-based contributions that could only cover workers that were in a firm. But if you think about it from an insurance point of view and you think about it from a risk point of view, that's not right. Because what you would like to do is to insure everybody against risks that are common to everybody. Falling ill is not a risk that is associated with being in a firm or not being in a firm. Dying is not a risk associated with being in a firm. Disability is not a risk. And longevity is not a risk associated with you're going to be with a firm or not with a firm. On the other hand, being fired by the firm, unemployment, or being in a firm that doesn't do the safety arrangements properly and you have a work accident, are risks that are associated with the firm. But in most Latin American countries and many other countries, all these risks, whether they have something to do with a firm or they have nothing to do with a firm, are financed through wage-based contributions. And that's how the system was born. That has two problems. First, by construction, it will never cover everybody. It's just going to cover workers that are in firms. And secondly, it usually doesn't really work very well, so that the value of the contributions is not represented 100% in benefits to workers, so that somewhere there's an implicit tax, and that in fact, employment in firms is going to be taxed, and it's going to be either reduced or shifted into cheating and small firms and the stuff we all know about. So the system, as initially designed, is not well thought out in the sense of the mapping of risks, populations, and sources of finance is flawed from the beginning. And then that system evolves because it left out a lot of people by design. It left out a lot of people. So in we come to try to patch up the system in whatever way we can with what we've called now non-contributory programs. This is a misnomer. They should really be called contributory programs, not from wage-based contribution, but contributed from somewhere else. And these non-contributory programs end up segmenting the system more, because now for some people you pay for some benefits through a particular form of taxation, and for other people you pay for the same benefits or similar benefits for a different source of foundation. And the end result is what I sometimes call the paradox of social protection. Social protection is meant to be the core element of social inclusion in society. As we have it today in Latin America, and it is evolving in other parts of the world, it is actually a system of endogenous segmentation. It endogenously segments, it provides different benefits for people with similar abilities, or worse, as people transit between different occupations, the state gives them a different treatment, coverage of different risks with different levels of benefits. And it generates unnecessary trade-offs between equity and efficiency. Because as we deepen this potash, this soup of all sorts of programs, all in the interest, quote-unquote, of social protection, what we're really doing is generating a very complex system of incentives affecting people's behaviors in many margins along cheating, not cheating, being self-employed, not being self-employed, being a large firm, being a small firm, being a firm with this contractual structure, short-run contracts, long-run contracts. There's about 20 years now of literature of many, many impact evaluations along many dimensions that if we put it all together, the picture when we put it all together is actually, at the end of the day, not a pretty picture. So yes, grow, invest, and insure, but we really have to rethink social insurance. And I think the direction to go is to think of universalist programs. And universalist programs means that everybody that is exposed to the same risks should get same level of protection, but the same source of finance. And this immediately shifts the social protection discussion to the domain of taxation. And because we have not really fundamentally, there is of course analytical work, but in many of the policy discussion, the social protection guys are just worried about extending social protection, the taxation guys are just worried about getting revenue to make the system. We have to really bring the taxation issue at the core and to bring issues about who pays for what, what is the right level of benefits, and how the system is really redistributive in a fundamental sense and not in a sense that it's not working today. This brings the political economy issues of social acceptability of taxation. Ravi, who's sitting here, has been leading that discussion, does tons of work on that. But my plea is, as we look forward in social protection, let's just not expand social protection by any combinations of programs. Let's insure properly. Let's map properly risks with populations, with sources of finance, and let's not avoid the taxation discussion. It's been extremely costly to pretend that there's not a taxation issue between what at the end of the day is a taxation issue, and the result is social exclusion, and in many cases, Mexico is a country I know well, stagnation as a result of very perverse incentives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We will come back to the issue of who's going to pay for what in the panel discussion, so hold that thought. But also thank you for reminding us that the situations that, or the systems that we have didn't just emerge yesterday, but we have inherited and actually built those systems. So maybe this polycrisis is actually an opportunity to rethink what kind of systems we want to have and envision that. So let's get back to that. But before we do, I would like to invite our fourth panelist to join the debate. Please.
Thank you so much, Elina and colleagues, and of course, UNU-WIDER. I guess we work very well together here in Finland and we collaborate, and the unfortunate thing is that I kind of always end up being at the deep end with these scholars who have a lot of knowledge and research, and then I'm a civil society representative and trying to learn to swim. But maybe just a couple of perspectives, and I think it's very easy to start from where you left. So my perspectives are basically two. One is I was born in Finland, I was raised here. I never knew what it is to struggle to get an opportunity to school, or if I got sick, I had healthcare available. If there were social issues, there was that network, but we are struggling at the moment for the sustainability of that network. And then when I was 23-year-old young man, minus 50 kilos and a lot more hair than I have now, I ended up in the Rwandan refugee camps in Tanzania. And of course, there were also Burundis and refugees from DRC. And there you see then the other side of the story. So for the Tanzanians in those areas, there was basically no or very little social protection available. And then there were the international organizations and civil society organizations giving the social protection services needed for the refugee communities. And of course it's a shock. I mean, you're 23, 24, and then you come into a totally different world. So I'm happy that this discussion has already touched on two sides of the social protection. One is, of course, the economic cushioning, but I think at least equally important is the inclusion aspect and the aspect of social protection in terms of that we belong to a group, that the group takes care of us and we are part of a society. And I think this is something that we need to come back to now. And they were also mentioning about human rights, but basically if you take it one level up, it's about values. And when we talk about values globally, then we need to talk about leadership. And I think if you look at leadership today, are we talking about social protection, or are we basically talking about some hard values of basically protectionism rather than opening for social protection sort of politics and politics, so we are turning inward. And I'm scared for the first time in my life, I'm 53 now, really of where is the global leadership in terms of values going. All the systems, in my opinion, and this is just my humble view, that they reflect values. They are built to reflect certain values. It's not the other way around, that system builds values. So what kind of protection are we talking about? And I'm raising here, from the civil society point of view, humanitarian needs that are there. 300 million people globally in need of humanitarian assistance. 122 million plus people forcefully forced out of their homes, basically people on the move. So how do we in the future protect those if I would say the value environment globally is what it is? And here we have to start from home. Of course, the sector that I represent, and I think we many work with, are in shock of the recent cuts to the development and humanitarian sectors by the US government. But it started earlier from our home. It started from Europe. We saw similar kind of turns in the policies that lately happened now in a massive scale in the US, but we are all involved. So we need to come back to the basics, I would say. What are our values as humanity? How and who will defend those values for us? Because nobody else will do it for us. And there we need the research, but we also need the civil society and the practitioners. And I think the biggest lesson that I learned in those Rwanda refugee crises, and as I said, there were other neighboring countries involved, presented in that area, was really the fact that, yes, social protection starts from the community. They might not have had the biggest resources available, but everything was shared. And I think there is a lesson to be learned that there are existing systems in the communities that we work with, and those should be strengthened as well. Then comes the question of what the state can do, and again, a discussion of what the state should do and what not to do, because we might end up in a system that is just simply impossible to implement. But strengthen values, strengthen common humanity, strengthen the talk about human rights and values, and that's how the local communities, as the first respondents, will absorb a lot of that shock. COVID is often discussed as how it left people behind and how it came as a shock to school systems and all of that, which is, of course, true. But if there were not those resilient local communities, the impact would have been far, far worse. The communities came together, they started organizing schooling and so on and so forth, so there was that response, and I think we should have a re-look at that on top of then of what the state can do and what perhaps then the global community can do, for example, in cases of refugees and people on the move, people who are forcefully pushed for migration. Again, coming from Finland, one of the things that we need to keep in mind when we talk about social protection, and then we talk about vulnerabilities, and I think it is the children often who are most vulnerable. The school system is a massively important way of social protection. And if I look at our own organization, majority of our work concentrates on, first of all, ensuring that there's an access to schooling system, whatever the circumstances are. And it doesn't only mean building school structures, but it really means that there's a teacher, and that teacher gets support so that the children are able to continue in schooling. In Ukraine, it might be that you are in a metro station, basically, in a makeshift school because of the bombings and all of that. But in other areas as well, coming to school, and then comes an important thing, that is the school feeding, nutrition, safety, security, peers, and then a sense of continuity amidst crisis. So I think that's also an asset and an aspect that we should consider because of such a huge and increasingly growing number of people that we need to protect our children. They are in the countries where the population growth is contrary to Finland and probably Sweden as well. So our demographics are challenging in this respect. But this is not elsewhere in the world. And then perhaps finally an aspect to it that who sort of steers the discourse in the future of social protection. And I think that will also reflect in a major way of what kind of social protection systems are put in place in the future. And part of this is, of course, political, but it's also donor communities, that who are the donors of tomorrow or today, increasingly, in many of the systems that we work with, many of the universities, many of the development organizations and such, and they are from the Gulf states, China, Turkey, for example. There probably are others. Of course, in Latin America, a lot of countries are now increasingly coming into the play. So I think that's another discussion, that where do we get the influence and what do the future systems then look like? But back to the values and back to the leadership, and that is needed. And there I agree with my colleague here that it's very important discussion. It's not only about the system, it's about the values, it's about inclusion, and it's about the local perspective as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for putting values back on the table. We will now move on to a kind of more interactive section, and we have a cluster of mics at Tommy, so we will need to share them a bit more democratically as we go along. But the first set of questions, I just wanted to come back to the topic of the panel, which is the polycrisis. We have talked about different types of crises, but how about the crisis on the social protection systems? I mean, what have we learned about the resilience of the systems as such? Are there different types of systems that are more resilient to shocks, and how should we better risk assure these systems? There's a general question for you all, but I would like to start coming back to Tommy's point, because you added the value crisis on the list of crises that we're going through at the moment. How do we build resilience against value crisis? What is the response to a new type of events that we see?
Well, that's a million-dollar question, if not more. And it's of course that my perspective is limited from where I come from, but I mean definitely from Scandinavia, from Europe, we need to really call for an awareness of what is really happening. Finland being a very small country in a very interesting geographical kind of a situation here, we know what it is to be protected by systems where we can have some sort of predictability and trust, and that is of course the international rules-based order. And if that's shattering, it is scary, to be honest. So therefore we need voices, we need advocacy. But then again, I think the answer to sustainability and the answer to something that works is local. So I think we need to keep our ears and eyes open to the local voices that are there on the ground. Because after all, then in the big picture, they have to sustain it. And I think you mentioned here about how important it is that there's a social acceptance to whatever is on the ground. And it comes to taxation, and it comes to getting those systems funded. Just as an example from Tanzania, where I started, is that, of course, being very naive 23-year-old person, at the time they introduced VAT in Tanzania. And a couple of my workers, I kind of noticed that maybe they were not so enthusiastic about the VAT or any tax collection whatsoever. And it was exactly about the leadership. They didn't trust about the systems. So if you have a transparent system, if you have basic levels of education where people see and they can read and they can really feel the benefits, I think that's the key to the social sustainability of those systems. So I cannot think of a better answer, but it depends on the where you are and what is your position. But I think in Scandinavia and Europe, we need to raise our voices and be really vocal about that. Let's not lose what has worked. Let's improve it.
Thank you very much. It takes a long-term work to vaccinate against sudden shifts. But I mean, let's get back to Dan's different, you were talking about different types of systems, adaptive models, graduation models, anticipatory action models. Are there any of those that are more shock resistant or resilient in the polycrisis world, or what's your recommendation? What are the learnings from the recent crisis?
Yeah, I want to pivot a little bit towards my colleagues here, and they've really kind of raised a flag here for kind of making sure that values are at the center of this, that inclusion is at the center of this. I mean, what I anticipate going forward is that in many countries, many of the governments that we work with to try to help build effective social protection systems, they're going to be under stress. That's not entirely new, right? So we've been saying, like, the kind of crisis that feels in some ways like it started just this year was already underway to some extent in terms of a lot of pressure on funding for humanitarian assistance, for social protection systems. And to be honest, we already saw some fatigue among some government partners for the cost of these systems. Certainly fiscal fatigue has been a problem for some time, but also fatigue about this focus on social protection and poverty. A little bit of, you know, just a desire to kind of move the conversation away from need towards other dimensions of, you know, of their governing. That's problematic because, you know, where major governments of, you know, many large countries no longer really want to invest or are pivoting the models towards things that are not likely to be so effective. This potentially creates a lot of risk. The Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia is being questioned. It's being redesigned now into a model that is much more of a sort of ag-led development model that may be effective, but they would be walking away from, you know, a model that for 20 years has actually really continued to improve and strengthen and developing all of the kind of systems that, you know, are robust and allow them to then adapt in the moment when things happen. So I fear that a sort of a big shift there creates an awful lot of risk. As programs are getting under greater pressure, something that I think has been a strength within the work on poverty programs generally is this desire to sort of test, a willingness to kind of experiment, if not formally experiment, but actually try different things. I think that's going to be needed to help us learn. So I don't have a winner for you, and you know, these among these different models. I hope as we do that, we keep inclusion as a center point. We made a lot of progress in terms of gender dimensions of inclusion and social protection, and yet not that much progress, we often say. If you look at most programs, right? Like they've done okay, there's a lot more they could do. So I hope the innovation, even as it becomes tighter, that we continue to sort of try to do better on these things.
Great, thank you. I mean, social protection is possibly the most researched area, rigorously researched area. So we pretty much know what works and what not, and keep innovating. So thanks for reminding us of keeping us on that journey. Amber, would you like to weigh in on this discussion on what we've learned in shock resilience? I mean, the care economy was very much discussed during the pandemic. So what emerged, different ways of working from there?
Yeah, thank you. And I was hoping that Tommy would solve our values crisis for us because, I mean, it's, as many of you in the audience, I'm sure, have also felt, you know, despair, very angry at the way things are going. And so that would be a great one to solve. So in terms of, you know, what we've learned on gender and inclusion, I think rightly in the COVID crisis, we saw a lot of focus on care. You know, we knew girls were increasing domestic work in the household more than boys. We knew women were, you know, retreating from the labor force at higher rates than men, and we knew this in part due to very great, rapid data collection and surveys that were going on in the first part of the pandemic. And I think what we saw is that, you know, despite this focus on unpaid care and gender, the systems, the social protection systems were quite resilient. We had a huge, massive increase in social protection to the note of something like $2.9 trillion. But we also knew from the UNDP, UN Women Tracker, that less than 1/5 of those measures took into account gender by either focusing on unpaid care or women's economic inclusion. And so we sort of saw this resiliency in the system, but then at the same time, this retreat in terms of equality, or at least, we think equality went sort of out the door when we were trying to move cash or other assistance very efficiently. And so, this is quite unfortunate, and we need to do better at sort of gender and inclusion proofing programs and systems before the next crisis in quotes, because you can think about this same sort of dynamic applying to climate change, to other sorts of crises, how gender and inclusion could go out the door in the name of efficiency. So, at the same time, I think it wasn't all bad, because during COVID, we saw some dropping of conditionalities, more relaxed inclusion criteria, which was great from a gender and inclusion point of view. And, we're still having these debates about proxy means tests and conditionalities. It's time. We learned this in the last crisis, that we need to drop these sorts of things that exclude the most vulnerable. But I think from, just to bring it back, from a perspective of innovation and what we should do better in the future, I would just argue that we really need to make sure that our innovations are including a gender and inclusion lens. So if you're going to register farmers for your next index insurance, whether shock responsive social protection scheme, make sure you're talking to female farmers. Make sure you have female agents that are going to enroll those female farmers. If you're running some cool algorithm that's going to tell you who to target because of impact over needs, make sure that you're not excluding those who need it most. So it's almost like retrofitting, a gender and inclusion lens to your innovations going forward. Let's not lose that in the name of sort of the next technological frontier that we're going to move towards in the social protection system.
Thank you. I mean, I guess you were alluding that we should never let a good crisis go to waste, and let's learn from whatever innovations that came out of it. Santiago, back to you. You were talking about the endogenous segmentation of the system that was leading us to a system that possibly nobody wanted, and you were referring to having a more universal programs that would be preferred. Tommy was then steering the pot and saying that people are on the move, so they are possibly not even national programs, but global universal programs. So how do we get there? So is this the opportunity to move to a different types of system, or how do you would envision the future?
I'm not far-fetched to think about a global system. I couldn't say anything useful about that. I do think there's plenty of space to move to universal systems, at least at the national level, conceived with national governments. And universal systems have various characteristics if we're going to use properly the word universal. Universal means everybody in society is covered by the program. But it also should mean same quality. So if we're talking about health, you might not get cancer treatments with the top of the latest, techniques or whatever, but whatever is established as basic care should be of the same quality for all citizens, not contingent upon income, gender, location, whatever. Universal means universal in that dimension. And then the third dimension that I was emphasizing is in the form of financing according to the risk that you're referring. Going to school should be financed from a universal source. That is done today in most countries from general taxation. But for historical reasons, really no substantive analytical reason, but mostly historical, health is not financed in the same way that education is financed. And it's a source of great inequities. So universal means same financing for risks that are common to all the population of the country. And then the last dimension is quality. And I think there, in the social protection sphere, we've done a huge amount of work, many of us and all of us in this room and elsewhere, on coverage and extending coverage, not enough on quality. And a lot of the resilience, when you were asking the question about resilience, being Latino, I always think of resilience and think about the fiscal side, right? You know, that's kind of in your DNA. If you come from Latin America, you think about the fiscal. But there's another dimension, which is some people have exited the system in the Hirschman sense of the word exit. They don't want to belong to the institutions of the state, not because they're excluded, but because they themselves chose to exit the institutions of the state, because the state provides very bad quality services. And that's another source of segmentation, because those who can afford the private education, whatnot, will do that, or private security even now, these days, and those will not do it. So resilient systems not only have the characteristics of universal and proper funding and all that, they must also have sufficient quality, not perfect, but sufficient quality such that citizens want them to continue, as opposed to citizens wanting to exit from them because they don't deliver. And the dimension of quality vis-a-vis coverage has not received as much attention as it does, as it should. And looking forward, as we do analysis and papers on social protection, let's work more on what can improve quality, incentives, measurement. There's a huge agenda there in terms of improving quality, which would do a lot of inclusion in the universalist sense that I mean here.
Great, thank you for making a great segue also to the next topic. I will open the floor in just a minute, but before doing so, I just wanted to bring that elephant in the room into this discussion as well. We're not just hit by health crisis, climate crisis, conflict crisis, value crisis, but we're also being hit by a financing crisis of this. And there is a need to get more out of what we have at the moment, improve the quality and increase of that. So I promise to get back to the funding issues, so I will keep my word. I mean, how do we work with social protection systems within the current funding pressures? Do you see new actors stepping up, showing leadership, or that this is the opportunity to really rethink that space? And when arguing for more funding, how do we make that case in a political area where we have all the evidence in the world about effectiveness of many of the programs, and yet that doesn't seem to get traction? So how do we work in this current funding situation? Would you like to continue on that?
I'm not sure what I say is relevant for all countries, developing countries, but certainly for the segment of middle income or low to middle income countries it is. If you look at measures of tax burden relative to GDP and compared to countries the gap sometimes is large, and the gap is associated with evasion, corruption, and lack of trust. And so governments have low tax capability because the relationship between the citizen and the state is dysfunctional. The relationship between the citizen and the state is the citizen is, look, stay away from me as much as you can, I'll pay as little as I can, I don't expect much from you, just leave me alone. So it's hard to increase the tax base. You've got to build the trust, you have to fight on corruption credibly, and you've got to deliver the services, and that's the hard work. And then you earn the right to raise taxes. There's an intertemporal issue here, right? You can't improve services unless you have more money, but that's what the multilaterals are for, and what you can lend. But conceptually, what you want is to rebuild the relationship between the citizen and the state to one of trust, less corruption, and one that then settles some level of benefits. Doesn't have to be 40% of GDP like in the OECD, but you know, if it was 30% of GDP in Latin America, grand, you know, much better than today. 5 points of GDP of taxation additional would do grand things if the money is not stolen, if there's trust, and if it's translated into quality services.
Great. I guess that brings us back to Tommy's point on building these institutions and trust over a longer period of time. and making what is locally needed. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you for saying the word. I had in my notes that where did the word corruption disappear from our discussions? So it is a matter of fact, just like you said, that the easiest way when people in certain countries, leaders want to stay in power is to use it for the friends and to buy votes and all of that. But I think that people, when they feel and when they get the services at a certain level, and in my small theory is that wherever you are, you can always maintain the average, but the average in relative to that location. And then the second thing, if you look at the refugees and if you look at people on the move, I think there are simply legislative issues that could help in financing, because I mean refugees are many at times educated, they've worked, they've done businesses if they had the right to work, and if they could sort of access the work markets and all of that, that could alleviate the burden from being sort of funded by outside sources. But then it's a political issue again. Are they allowed? Are they seen as resources rather than a burden? And yeah, whatever we talk about social protection and design the systems, I think an element of empowerment should be in there. Of course, you always have people who, due to illnesses and other restrictions, cannot sort of fully engage, but people want to maintain dignity, and a shock is a shock, but they want to recover and become, in quotes, normal citizens again as soon as possible.
Thank you. Amber and Dan, do you want to come in on the financing issue before we open the floor? Or you're good.
Yeah, I feel like I see things going in a couple of directions. I've seen with some of the governments that we work with at IFPRI, where we've worked most closely in kind of advising and helping them sort of being part of their kind of learning agenda. I've seen this benefit of, you know, when programs are working well, have scaled up, relatively newly effective, that there's that trust issue. You can sense that there's sort of a political benefit there as well, not in a governance. I don't mean in a sort of nefarious, like that it's not. I'm not talking about corruption that exists, but I'm talking about the strength of an effective functioning safety net system is that it helps to build that trust, strengthen governance, and then Santiago said very well, that becomes the basis then for many other things that governments need to do, including taxation to fund public service, public good provision. So I've seen that, and I think that's very hopeful, even in times of stress. Hopefully, those countries that have built that up recently can lean into that. What I expect in other places is that you're going to see a sort of a weakening of the safety net. It's going to be thinned out. There's going to be, you know, people dropped from their roles under the kind of pressures that I was describing before. And we're going to see the type of increased food insecurity, increased unrest, civil unrest that we have seen before. And not that it's already here, but that's what I expect is a trend of that increasing. That is the argument that we have tried to make around essentially the soft power argument of humanitarian assistance, foreign assistance, social investment, is to strengthen those ties and avoid the type of stress and unrest that ultimately comes home to roost everywhere. But that's out of favor, that thinking now, and hopefully, I don't know, better angels can sort of hear these things again and start to bring it back, because I just fear that we're headed, as I said, I see some hope, some reasons for hope, and a lot of risks. Thanks.
Thank you for reminding us on the risks. But on the other side, the pendulum will swing back, and I think it's important to keep on talking about these issues and reminding us of the evidence that exists. You have been very patient. I believe there are 2 mics that circulate in the room, and if I can just get a show of hands, how many questions we have in the room. I'm slightly blended by So we take, the first round will be this part of the room, and the second part will be that part of the room. We'll start at the front, and then we go backwards. Who has the mics? Yes.
Thank
okay,
you.
We'll take you later. Yes.
My name is Daphne. I'm with UNU-WIDER in Maastricht, and I'm coming from a practitioner background, and that's also a little bit where my question is coming from. Because what I've seen in many sub-Saharan African countries is that social protection is definitely still not seen as a right. Not by government, but also not by a lot of its people. And at the same time, I've also seen that informal social protection systems are actually very strong. And that's not surprising because the state is in many cases very young still. And these ties between kinship, communities, clans, religious ties are just very strong and much longer there. So my question is there maybe room to bring the two a little bit closer together? Also building on Tommy's point, you know, because it's not true that there is no social protection in the absence of provision by the state. There's actually a lot that will be the first point of contact before people even access state social protection. And then maybe in addition to that, just a point, we started with a few people, a community of practice on informal social protection that you can find on socialprotection.org. And if you want to access that, come to me and I can help you. Thanks.
Great, thank you for the ad. This is a place for networking. We'll take it during dinner. Deepak, you had a, if we can get the mic, thanks.
Thank you, Chair. You know, at this juncture, when the world is confronted with multiple crises, the need for more and better social protection is both necessary and desirable. But I want to bring in another elephant in the room. Just as the need is rising, the willingness and ability of governments to provide the resources for that social protection is diminishing rapidly. And I want to say that, you know, it's not just in the developing world, in the poor countries, that struggle to find resources for social protection. They could do much better in terms of resource allocation and resource utilization for various corruption. But even in industrial societies, social protection has been progressively diluted and risk has been privatized. You mentioned the quality of healthcare, of schooling, of a whole range of things that industrial societies took for granted. So whether you look at the US, Britain, France, Germany, everywhere this is happening. Now, the elephant in the room I'm referring to is a profound change in politics. At the end of the day, social protection was an integral part of the ideology of social democracy. But social democracy has eroded, and eroded rapidly. You just look at Western Europe, you look at North America, and you look at large parts of the global South. Politics has changed so profoundly, and you have governments on the far right, elected by democratic processes, who seek to undermine those very processes that bring them to power. Now, in this situation, you know, can we be hopeful that there will be A, resources for social protection, and B, a willingness to make better social protection systems? I think it's no longer about the ability, it's about the willingness of governments to do this. And who will hold them accountable for not doing this? And I am convinced that the industrial societies, the North, needs to pay as much attention to it as the South.
Yes, Thank you very much for adding yet another crisis, of political crisis here. I don't see the hands anymore. There is one at the far back, one in the middle, and one there, and then we close. Yes.
I'm Veronika Burzak. I'm social protection specialist at the International Labour Organization. I would like to come to the suggestion that I sympathize very much with, to have a universal approach to social protection provision. However, I would want to question this approach of then decoupling social insurance from wage employment. I can see that this has failed in many countries. When these systems were first built, it was with a vision of economies would formalize and it would be possible to cover the majority of workers through those systems. But I would argue, rather than giving up on this, we now have a new opportunity of really making them happen. With new technologies, it should be easier to formalize, to track those with contributory capacity, to find solutions for irregular contributions of agricultural workers or of self-employed who don't have a steady flow of income. So the question is, do we give up or do we reinforce efforts of making this work? And I'm saying this also because of what the previous speaker said. I mean, is it realistic to hope that under the current circumstances, the tax revenues would be dedicated to building up such universal approaches? And if we see the amount of social protection expenditure that is currently generated through social security contributions, it seems very risky to suggest to give up on that as a source of financing social protection systems. So I think we would rather argue, let's try and make them work again and find solutions for those that are not covered, because yes, not everybody is in wage employment.
Thank you. Did we have the mic in the middle and at the back? Yes.
Thank you. A very interesting panel. I'd like to tease Santiago into a response. I agreed with much of what he said. I begin by quoting Tom Paine. He said, "It is not charity, but a right, not bounty, but justice that I am demanding." And I think we also should include not just insurance, but rights, economic rights. And I feel that that's left out. And I want to give an example which is extremely important. 3 years before WIDER came into existence, the United Nations passed UNCLOS, which the Secretary General of the UN described as the most important legal instrument of the 20th century. And in doing so, 71% of the world's surface was turned into an official commons. And the part of the UNCLOS was that any mining, any taking of resources from the seas should only take place if a sharing mechanism that gave every country in the world and every person in the world a share of the proceeds. And no deep sea mining should take place. Now, that's a commons. You could give other examples. What Trump has just done in an executive order is to allow American capital to go anywhere in the world and take resources from the sea. I think we ought to be saying economic rights are equally important as any insurance system.
Thank you. And those who don't see the room on the web, that was guys standing. We have the last speaker. Could you just introduce yourself and quick question? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Sebastian, PhD fellow here at UNU-WIDER. Santiago mentioned the idea of exit of the state, and sometimes the exit the state implies collective action and social protection through collective action and self-government. I would like to know your opinion about this idea of that communities can provide social protection by themselves outside of governments, and if you consider is a viable or feasible mean to provide social protection across Global South mostly? Thank you.
Great, thank you. There are a lot of good and big questions. I will need to ask our panelists for short answers for those. We have questions about bringing the informal systems closer to the formal systems, the crisis in politics, the decoupling of social protection from wage employment, collective actions. You take your pick. You don't have to answer all the questions, but the ones that hit home.
Yes, if I can quickly respond to that, I think it should be so. And I think in the opening statement I said that it's very important to agree that what should be taken care of by the sort of official states and the governance and through taxes and taxation, and then what is sort of inherent in the communities. I think at least the minimum we should do is not to disrupt or do away with systems that work already. So we need to be very careful with that and also think that it's about dignity and autonomy at the grassroots level. So that happens anyway, and they exist, the systems are there anyway. So let's boost them and rather look where are the complementarities rather than think them as too old-fashioned or something. They work for probably thousands of years, many times. The only challenge I see in the locally led sort of local community-based system is that there is a danger that they come biased so that those who have are favored, and I think that's where the task of the state is really to ensure is justice and equal distribution of the assets.
Would you like to continue? You had a direct question for you.
Thank you for the questions. All very interesting. I won't take all. On the question of, I'm not arguing for full decoupling. I'm saying some risks and some elements of social protection should be covered by wage-based contributions. Those particular risks that are associated with a firm-worker relation, unemployment, work accidents, stuff like that. The rest, you say, look, technology allows now to improve enforcement throughout, and therefore we could just go the route of improving enforcement, including more people, and that's the route to universality. That's fine. Then we're basically just talking about earmarking and the difference of a contribution, which is earmarked for a particular benefit, versus the taxes, which goes into general revenues and then can then go used for different things. Should education be also funded through an earmarked tax equal contribution, or why not? It doesn't matter if we don't argue about the labels. If you had a system of perfect enforcement throughout, and in which the system of contributions, call them taxes, taxes call them contributions, doesn't matter, were the same for everybody in a way that guaranteed quality and universality in the sense that I defined them earlier, then we're just really talking about the label. And it's irrelevant. But I think we're far from perfect enforcement, and we're far from willingness to pay because of the quality issues that I was talking earlier. So in my reading, the fastest route to universality would be by pursuing it through general taxation, at least in the countries in which there is room to do so. This might not be a general recipe for everybody. But it's just, we're talking about tactics. We're not really talking about conceptual, the aim of what we really want to do. On the Tom Paine, yeah, I mean, Amber mentioned it during her talk, and I assume it. If you go for universality, you're talking about social rights. I don't know whether you want to call them economic rights or social rights, it doesn't matter. But you're talking about rights. You're talking about putting in the Constitution, every citizen of this state shall have the right to healthcare of equal quality as established in the health law. Is that an economic right or social? I don't know. Whatever it is, I'm talking about a system of rights that doesn't discriminate against anybody on the basis of gender. So I'm fully in agreement with you. And last question, not to monopolize the microphone, the last question back there, but there was also a related question about social protection within kinships or within families or within, it's a really deep and interesting question. the analytical side to that, in my view, is what is the optimal level of risk aggregation? And should you want to aggregate risk at what sort of a population to make insurance as effective and as cheap as possible? That said, it also touches issues of what is being part of a state and what is part of a nation state. What are things that are common to all the citizens of the state? And is healthcare something that is common to all the citizens of the state? Or no, that it's not, only paying taxes for the army, but healthcare will leave to kinships and to communities. And I guess that's a philosophical question. My answer to that, but maybe I'm too much of a statist, is healthcare is part of being citizen of a state.
Thank you. Amber?
Sure. I just wanted to pick up on the one point on informal social protection, and just, again, you know, if it's not broken, don't fix it, but also what we know from research is that social protection often reaches those who are the most socially excluded, whether it be because they have disabilities or some other sort of social stigma. And so I would just say that we shouldn't, we shouldn't leave those people to fall through the cracks. And I think that's what social protection is aimed to do. We know from research that social assistance gives people dignity and puts them into those social networks where they can then access the more informal insurance or networks or support. So I just wanted to say that we can't let them fall through the cracks despite a good functioning informal networks that exist.
I'm not going to top that. I'll leave it. I agree with Santiago and Amber very well on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I know my panelists have other commitments. We're getting close to the closing. With your permission, do we have 5 more minutes? Done. Yes, thank you. Yes. And for the audience as well, the food won't be here for another half an hour, so we might as well have just, I promised some questions from this. There you go, these two, and that's it. They're next to each other.
Thank you. I'm Yashodhan Ghurpade from the World Bank. I wonder, given this crisis of also, in addition to everything else, values and perhaps some of the appeals that are made for social protection will fall on deaf ears in many countries with many governments. Is it not, to put it a bit provocatively, only practical to highlight widen the appeal of social protection to also speak to some other motivations around productivity, around shock absorption, around other aspects that may appeal to a wider audience? Is that a way to deal with, regimes and governments that personally many of us may not necessarily agree with, but are here to stay?
Thank you. How do we sell the product? Yes.
So I would like to, Leandro de Magalhães from Bristol, 2 questions about trade-offs. So one would be, today, I think the political discourse in the UK is we had hit by a financial crisis, then we get hit by the COVID crisis, then that goes through the roof, and now we have a war. And now there's a trade-off. Should we use the resource of the state to defend the international base order and we should invade another country, or and then retract from other areas like aid? And is that a valid trade-off? That'll be my question. And the other trade-off would be the informal social system versus the formal. Is there a trade-off between the informal and the formal one? If we go in with the state, are we going to lose some of the informal? So those are the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Huge questions, but great questions to round off with. So how do we make the case, and should we bundle it with other arguments to build up the social protection systems, and what trade-offs are we willing to tolerate in this current day and age? I would like to have this round as our final round, and while we are talking about difficult trade-offs, if you have any message of hope that was asked here, or a call to action, some of the groups that are present here today, researchers, policymakers, evidence producers. What is the next step? Where do we go from here? This goes for all the panelists, and I see Santiago is good to go, so we'll start from there. So go.
Is that better? Yeah. I think the first question is excellent, and I only have a partial answer. I do this because the light is on my face. And this very much varies from country to country, so this is not a generalized answer. But in the countries that I've studied, certainly Mexico, but I would say the same for Colombia, for Peru, for other countries, not all, but some countries in LAC. Social protection as it currently stands is so badly designed that is not only a problem of exclusion in the social sense, lack of coverage, gender discrimination, all the things that we mentioned before, but it's also a source of large inefficiencies because as it is designed, it generates too much self-employment and too many very, very small firms that are slightly below productivity. So there are other reasons for this, having to do with small tax regimes, having to do with imperfect contract enforcement, but certainly social protection is part of the reason, not the only, but part of the reason for the very huge dispersion in productivity that we see of firms, across firms in Latin America, for the large left tail of the productivity distribution, and for the smallness of firm sizes, very skewed size distribution of firms, and large self-employment. Part of the explanation for that lies in the incentive structure of taxing salaried labor, subsidizing self-employment, and subsidizing non-salaried contractual relations. So yes, there's a selling point, at least in some countries, that you can go to the finance minister and say, look, Mr. Minister, you might have a heart of steel, and you might not care about any of these social inclusion stuff, but it behooves you to do this because you will widen the tax base and you will increase the growth rate. So yes, there is a big selling point there.
I wouldn't start the dialogue by saying you might have a heart of stone. That might be the main selling argument, but the rest, yes. Amber, you want to go next?
I was passing to Dan.
You're passing.
I'll go next. Thank you. Yeah. So Santiago has a bold vision for us to really rework how this is all done in a way that would be much more efficient and through, essentially universal systems. I'm going to stay closer to where we're at. I like the vision a lot. From where we sit and kind of the conversations that I'm sometimes involved in, we do talk about, it's not just about sort of the inclusion dimension, but we never don't talk about that. We try to always include that. It makes the programs work better. There's even a productivity argument for inclusion, right? Underemployed women is a source of loss and efficiency in the economy. So, I mean, that's where, so we do make when we talk about the benefits, they are economic as well. So that's a central part of the argument in favor of social protection. A lot of social protection leads to better investments in children. So you get better school participation, you get better child health. That leads to a better, stronger labor force in the future. All of these things are sort of wrapped in and part of the argument. There's also still dimensions of inclusion or benefit that we haven't focused on. So one of the benefits that we've been working on lately is mental health. Mental health is generally just ignored. And certainly there's very weak investment in mental health in many of the lower and middle income countries where we work. We've been testing pretty effective low-cost group therapy models as part of one of the complements in like a cash plus or social protection system. I think we need to keep searching for these. So again, all of these things, it feels like we're kind of piling on outcomes, and yet in some cases they're right there at relatively low cost, and we've just been ignoring them. Yeah, in terms of informal, there is a trade-off to some extent, potentially, between formal and informal. In fact, I think Tausif's presentation this morning from Bangladesh, from TMRI, actually showed a reduction in remittances from households that got access to cash and food transfers. That's a super interesting area of work. So, but that just means a rebalancing of risk, right? So if my risk is being insured from the public sector, then I don't need to sort of rely on my social networks as much. So that's an appropriate rebalancing, I think. Thank you.
Great. And while you're passing the mic to Tommy, then Amber, and then Tommy gets the last word.
Okay, so maybe I'm going to answer some of the questions, but in a roundabout way. So in terms of the shrinking aid and trade-offs, I mean, I think obviously this is something we're all worried about, and especially as an American, seeing these mandates to take gender inclusion out of language, out of grants, et cetera, is very worrying. But I think maybe the saving grace for social protection is that by and large, social protection is not an aid model, right? It's run by the governments themselves in the driver's seat. It's not the UN, it's not the World Bank, it's actual nationally financed systems. And so how we then get gender and inclusion into those systems a bit stronger, I think that's really the question of the hour for me. And unfortunately, there hasn't been a lot of research on the political economy of gender and inclusion and social protection. There's a bit, and it has to do with ideologies, it has to do with accountability, and institutions, of course, embedding gender and inclusion into the institutions. But I guess that's sort of where I'm thinking and where sort of the saving grace is in terms of trade-offs and aid. I'm going to say that social protection shouldn't fundamentally be about productivity, and I don't have an answer to that point, but this is, sort of my strong belief. And then in terms of a call to action, I think, there's a lot of great emerging young researchers in this room. That's one of the nice things about this conference. And I would say, often you think researchers need to be, they need to have sort of they shouldn't engage in advocacy. They sort of have to be neutral, let's say. But I think we are all advocates as researchers because we choose what we do research on. And so I guess my call to action is for the young researchers in the room to do work that matters and that will be relevant to policy instead of just chasing that nice publication.
Yes, thank you. I think a colleague there said that first I think in Britain it was finances, then it was COVID, then it was the war. Sounds like a familiar rhetoric to me. So there is always an excuse, kind of, if we want to look at it that way. I understand the budgetary constraints like what we are going through in Finland and all of that, but we are talking about 0.5%. or something like that on our gross domestic income. So I think we can still look at our neighbor even beyond our own boundaries. Yes, Finland, small country, little budget, but we can all do something and make our contribution. Another thing is getting back to the values. I think I'm repeating myself, but my own organization, Finchurch Aid, was established to channel aid to Finland after the Second World War, when we were rebuilding the nation. In a bit more than 10 years of that point, 63 something, early 60s, we started to channel aid support outside of Finland. Were we a rich country in the early 60s? No, my mom had one dream as a young student, that I wish I had my own water closet one day so I wouldn't need to go outside of my house. That was Finland, early 60s in the rural. But still people wanted to help. So it's not about money, it's also about values, it's about the will. So the final comment, we have in Finchurch Aid the slogan, we don't give up. So let's not give up.
That's an excellent way to close the panel. We've covered a lot of space on how we got here, where we are today, and where we should be going. A heartfelt thank you for our speakers for generously contributing with your knowledge and sharing and engaging in this discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a huge round of applause. I would also like to thank WIDER for bringing us all together. It's an excellent panel, and thank you for entrusting me the moderation. Also, great thanks to everyone for contributing. Hopefully you will stay, keep talking, and also thank you for everybody joining us online. We'll continue during dinner. Thank you.